Hi, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started this afternoon. Thanks so much for logging in for what is our second to last session of this summer series. So we really appreciate Deb. Thanks for joining us tonight and hosting this session. We do have one more session coming up on Monday, which Julie will tell you a bit about at the end of today's workshop. I'm Christy Walkuski. For those of you that haven't joined another session, I'm director of the Brain Center here, and as I mentioned, Julie Robinson is also here with us. Everyone will remain muted for the beginning of this session, and we are going to have the chat feature turned off during the session. If you have a question, a clarifying question, or a technical issue, both Deb and I have shared our email in the chat box here, and feel free to reach out to us that way. And it's just to kind of keep conversation focused during the presentation and the interactive portions of this workshop. And this session, the beginning of it will be recorded, and then as we get into the dialogue and discussion, that portion will not be recorded. We want folks to feel like you can authentically engage during that portion. So rest assured that we will turn that portion, we will turn the recording off for that. I also want to just remind folks that this series and this session are rooted in the expectations established by BW's community standards of conduct. And so through that, we expect this to be a space where we can engage empathetically, respectfully, and thoughtfully together. Throughout this entire series this summer, we've been challenged to see how racism, white supremacy, and the policies and people that uphold these systems operate right in front of our faces, but simultaneously persist due to our ability and willingness to overlook them. And this, to me, is really rooted in the idea of privilege, the ability for some of us to look away or take a break from thinking about some of these things like race and racism. So I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Deb Esty here today. I know, Dr. Esty, you include this in so much of your work here at BW and outside of the boundaries of BW as well. Just a little intro to Dr. Deb Esty in case you haven't had the chance to connect with her during your time here. Dr. Esty earned a Bachelor's of Arts from the College of Wooster, a Master's of Arts in Community Counseling from Loyola University Chicago, and a doctorate from the University of Akron. Her research interests include diversity issues, food issues, stress and coping, fat prejudice, and eating disorders. Dr. Esty teaches courses on multicultural psychology, social psychology, and counseling psychology. So we are thrilled to have you here. Thank you so much for the time you've put into planning for this, and I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Christy. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, the Brain Center, for asking me to be a part of this and for hosting this series. Let me pull up, I'm going to pull up some slides, everybody. I'm going to turn off the chat, as Christy said. Pull up a slide. And as I pull up the slide, I just want to reiterate some things that Christy talked about at the beginning. So bear with me as I'm dual tasking. One of the things that I want to say is, as I welcome you and I think about you giving up your time today, I'm appreciative of you all being here. I'm appreciative of you being willing to do this work and being willing to engage in this work. And so I also have listed on this slide some people that I am going to utilize today, some people who have been important to me as I've thought about this work. There are also resources for you. So I'm sure many of you already know Peggy McIntosh's work or know Alan Johnson's book, Power, Privilege, and Difference. And I'm going to be pulling a lot from those today. But there are some other people here who I feel like, obviously, what I'm sharing with you today is nothing new. It's things that I've thought about, and I'm standing on the shoulders of others. And so I wanted to give those people the credit where credit is due. As we talk about today, Christy went over some of the kind of ground rules. And usually if we're doing power and privilege and we're doing some type of dialoguing, we spend some time talking about what are some common courtesies. I think that we all know that there are kind of guidelines of respect that we want to give each other as we talk. I also want to maybe make a few other suggestions as we go along today for you to think about, and you can take or leave as you like. I'm hoping you actually take more of them than you leave them, but these are some things for you to think about. First one that I would ask is, as we go into small groups, there are going to be 3 times today that I'm going to take you into small group discussion, where I'm hoping that you'll be able to turn on your cameras and you'll be able to engage with each other in some dialogue. When we get in small groups, I would hope that we can really talk about ourselves. And so I would ask you to use eyes and to really think about our own privileges. Christy mentioned that this is really, the series is about race. race certainly intersects with other identities. And so I'm going to ask us to talk about our privileges in multiple identities, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But if we could use I statements, and if we could also watch vilifying other people. So for those of you who know me, I have difficulty when we say, well, this person over there, right? He did this, or she did this, or that they did this. And instead of talking about ourselves, because Alan Johnson will talk about, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, that vilifying other people or pointing out as the bad person gets us off the hook in some ways. It says that they do something that I don't do. And so I'm hoping as we engage in small group that we're willing to take risks, use I statements, use ourselves as examples. And I'm also hoping that we can talk about our privileged identities. I think for me as a white woman, it's easier for me to focus on times that I have had oppression or microaggression or discrimination happen to me. It's harder to talk about times of privilege because they're invisible to me and I oftentimes don't know them. So when we get in small groups, if there are times, if you have no privileged identities, certainly then you can talk about others, but I'm hoping that we can use our privileged identities versus our oppressed identities today to kind of talk about our experiences. I also think I just want to say, remember that I can't represent all white women. Certainly in our small groups, nobody can represent everybody. So I'm also hoping that we don't ask anybody to do that in small groups. I know that also we're going to do the breakout groups today. And when Julie and Christy and I were talking there, when we were talking about power and privilege, it was mentioned that we are going to have students in the group today. And so when we do the small breakout groups, if you want to be in a student-only group, right before I break us out into small groups, each time I will give students a chance to raise their hand. And you could do that, if you don't know, through the small icon down below where you see the hand raised. If you do that, I will put you in a student-only group. And the reason for that would only be about power and privilege and not having to be in there with people who may feel like, they're evaluating or who have more privilege in an institution such as a university. Also, when we do small groups, I would ask that you pick a report person or somebody who's going to come back to the large group and report out. So just when we go to small groups, if you could think about those things as far as having a report out person and whether you want a small student group, let me know as we go along. All right, I think Christy also mentioned I have my email up. And so if you have a clarifying question or if you have a question you want me to discuss at the end, I would just ask that you send me an email at Esty, and I have STY if you don't know me, because sometimes people do Etsy instead. Send me an email and I will gladly answer those questions as we go along when there's space or at the end, depending on if it's a clarifying question or a question that needs a little bit more attention. All right, that was a lot. I think those are a lot of ground rules. So I'm going to go ahead and get us going. And so just to talk about some of the objectives for today, really my hope is that you leave in this hour dipping your toe into an understanding of privilege if you don't have that already. And so I'll go over the definition of privilege. I'll talk about the components of privilege. How do we know if somebody is privileged? I'll also then ask us to examine our own privileges in small groups, talk about why it's important to examine privilege and how that can help with looking at racism, sexism, heterosexism, and those intersections. And then I'll also ask us before we leave today to talk about one way in the next month that we may want to work on our privileges and to commit to that work over the next month. So those are the goals. I want to start us by looking at a clip that many of you may have seen before. This is a clip from Dateline. It aired quite a few years ago. And I think many of you are used to the components of what you're going to see. But as you watch this clip, I'm hoping that you will pay attention, particularly in this clip, to whether or not you see yourself. So let me go to sharing my screen, which is going to take me just a second, everybody, so hang tight. Hopefully you will be able to hear this. Sometimes I've had difficulty with people hearing. So if you can't hear it, Christy or Julie, I'm going to ask you to let me know, please, as we go along. All right, so again, this is a very short clip. I'm hoping that you will let me watch it and see where you see yourselves. Do you see yourself in this clip?
Clothes. So does Glenn. They do some browsing And right away, something catches our attention. When John walks up to this electronics counter, almost instant service. But just a few minutes later, when Glenn walks up, he is ignored by not one, but two salesmen standing a few feet away. We didn't make anything of it until it happened again and again.
Need some help?
In the shoe department at this store, John gets instant attention and a hearty welcome. Yet when Glenn walks in just 3 minutes later, the salesman looks away. We run a stopwatch as the salesman continues to stare past. No hearty welcome for him.
I was standing there and standing there and standing there. And John just barely skirts the fringe of the department. And the guy comes over and he's joking, he's laughing, and that did not happen for me.
All right, everybody. So take us back now. And what I'd like you to do is, this will be our first small group. So in small group, if there are any students who want to be in their own small group, could you raise your hand now, please, so I can write some things down?